Two death sentences are dominating the news on this Sunday. One for a man who reached the pinnacle of power in Egypt, the other for a teenage terrorist in America. An Egyptian court issued a sentence of capital punishment for ousted President Mohamed Morsi. The former leader of the Muslim Brotherhood and more than 100 others are condemned in connection to a prison break 4 years ago. Morsi, as you know, is already serving a 20-year sentence for actions he took against the opposition while in power. The death sentence will now be reviewed by religious authorities there. And in the United States, a federal jury voted unanimously that Zohar Tsarnaev should die for his role in the Boston Marathon bombing. He was 19 years old when he helped plant pressure cooker bombs at the finish line. 3 people were killed and more than 200 others were maimed in the explosion. Now 21, Tsarnaev has never expressed remorse for the crime. The trial was indeed emotional. Survivors and family members bearing witness to their agony as well as loss. The jury took only 14 hours to issue their sentence, but it could take years before an execution takes place. Of course, an appeal is likely. But there are practical and legal issues with the form of execution. Of course, that's lethal injection. We're here to discuss the Tsarnaev case. We have Dr. Vivian Shnainman, a forensic psychiatrist, and John Lauro, a trial lawyer and former federal prosecutor. Doctor, I want to start with you. So much was focused on Zohar in the courtroom there, his lack of remorse, slumping in his seat. I would think this probably had some effect on the outcome in terms of him getting the death penalty, in your opinion. What would you say?
I'm sure it did. I would think that people were probably thinking that he didn't care about the trial and didn't care about the outcome. But I don't think that we can draw a conclusion about somebody's thinking based on their behavior. I know that you obviously can't diagnose him, you weren't there with him, but if you were to look at it, just as a quick case in point, what would you say about this young boy? I mean, he really didn't show any remorse. He didn't take the stand. I guess the defense did not want him to take the stand. How would you kind of diagnose him in any form or fashion? Well, I'd have to say, first of all, I can't diagnose him because I never evaluated him. But I would want to know a few things. I'd want to know, first of all, was he medicated? You know, there are a lot of powerful psychotropic medications that can make somebody look really apathetic. And doctors might have thought they were helping him to feel calm, and they were really making him look completely tranquilized. I don't know if that happened or not. He may have been advised by his attorneys to not show any emotion. I don't know why they would do that, but that might have been part of their legal advice. And he may himself have thought that to show no emotion would have somehow made him look a certain way. Without actually asking him, there's no way to know.
Right.
I don't think that there was any psychiatric component to this trial. I think that a psychiatric evaluation might have added a lot of information to a trial like this one.
Perhaps so. John, I want to bring you in on this too. You know, we have other damning evidence, of course, what he wrote inside that boat outside of how we saw him in the courtroom. And I got to ask you, what about the appeal process right now? What can we expect in the way of an appeal?
We're looking at probably 5 to 10 years. I don't believe that he's going to be successful for the reasons that you raised. The jury got to look at him throughout the trial, and there was no sense of emotion, there was no sense of remorse, there was no sense that I committed this horrible act and I'm sorry. That's what the jury wanted to hear, and they didn't see it.
We've seen in the case prior to this Timothy McVeigh, of course, and he waived his appeal. Of course, he was put to death here. Do you think by any stretch of the imagination that his defense attorneys here in the Zohar's case might waive an appeal?
I don't know. You know, he says he's motivated by some religious belief, however misguided. He may say that this is his way to martyrdom and say, I'm welcoming death. We'll have to see.
We have all sorts of complications here, and Doctor, I want to get back to you in a second, but this whole issue of lethal injection, the cocktails that are put together, there have been problems with that. What do we face here in this particular case?
Many problems throughout the states. There's concern that it's cruel and unusual punishment because the lethal injection does not necessarily work, so people are suffering during the death process. However, on the federal side, it's been carried out in the McVeigh case. It was carried out successfully. I don't think that's an avenue of an appeal either.
Dr. Shnainman, I'm going to get back to you on this. There's been a lot of concern and contention as to whether or not he should spend life behind bars in prison in a maximum facility or the death. Some say that if he dies, he'll be a martyr. Can you tell us perhaps what it might be like for somebody in a maximum security jail in prison 23 hours in a small cell out of 24 a day? What does that do to one's mind?
It really depends on the person. I have a lot of experience working in prisons. I've worked with people that have been locked up for 23 hours a day. Some of them like it. Depending on the prison, depending on the rules of the prison, depending on the status of the prisoner, they can be in a little room, they have all their stuff, they have their TV, they have their books, they have their letters. They don't usually have internet access, but they can have a computer. Some of them can make a life in there. And for some people, it's not so unpleasant. For some of them, they have less frills, fewer frills, and it's not maybe not as pleasant. But life in prison isn't necessarily a horrible thing. For some people that have fewer less mental stamina, it's more difficult. But it is a lifetime in prison and outside of society.
We're talking about two prisons, possibly. Of course, the death penalty, there's one in Indiana, but also another one in Max in Colorado. And looking at that, they're talking about once you go through those gates there, you get into a situation there where you can't see the sky anymore. You have very small little rooms, little windows where you can't see out of. To me, it would seem almost perhaps worse than death, a lot of people
I've been in jails to visit clients, and when those doors shut tight and you hear it, it's an amazing process. He's going to live a horrible life if he's going to live any time at all. I would have argued to the jury that keeping him in jail is a more severe punishment than the death penalty. This was a jury that was death qualified. In other words, every person on that jury had to say, I accept the death penalty, which is much different than the state of Massachusetts overall. They wanted to exact punishment, and the defense should have emphasized the degree of punishment by putting him to jail for the rest of his life.
Well, the book is certainly not closed on this, especially for the victims that are still alive, and this will go on for quite some time, maybe 5, 10 more years in this case, but we'll keep our eyes on it. And I want to thank you, John Lauro, as well as Dr. Shnainman, for joining us on this segment of Arise Review. Very insightful.
Thank you.
Thank you.